Mordechai Yosef Ben Avraham, thank you for joining us again this week on TribeHerald.
Great seeing you, Mr. Jordan. How are you doing?
Very good, very good. So this week's Parshat Vaera, um, we're getting into a lot of the meat and potatoes of the story of redemption from Egypt. That we're getting into most of the plagues. Hashem has already given Moshe a name to say. Moshe is already making his claims in front of Paro. What are some things that jump out to you about this week's Parsha?
Yeah, the thing about this week's Parsha, there's a great connection between this week's Parsha and quantum physics. So how does it come together? So quantum physics says that the human eye sees less than 1% of reality, right? And in fact, the human eye doesn't necessarily see anything. That human eye actually absorbs light particles, and these light particles go to the back of the brain where images are formed. So most of what we experience in terms of reality is basically like kind of like genetic information and light impulses, like kind of like mixed together, and then we have this image of, oh, like I smell this, or this type of array hits my brain in this way, and this is kind of like how I respond. But the thing is, how it connects to this week's parsha is that quantum physics also says even though the human eye sees less than 1% of reality, or even the five senses as a whole, there's a whole 99% that's happening around us, meaning that like there's like a world of energy that's happening around us, all around us. And so what they do is they call that string theory, right? So string theory is this understanding of the energy that's around us. Now we had a great Kabbalist that came like over 500 years ago, or close to 500 years exactly, which his name is the Rabbi Isaac Luria. And the Rabbi Isaac Luria, you know, brought down this method of understanding this energy that science is kind of talking about now. But the Arizal goes even as far as to not just talk about the energy we can't see with our five senses, but he goes as far as to say, show how that energy itself goes all the way directly to the creator of everything. And that system that he developed, or not developed, I mean, other people said it's in Zohar, in different places, but this system was called the 10 spheros, right? The 10 sferot, right? And these are the 10 dimensions of how energy manifests itself into this reality from God. So you think about it, from a certain perspective, it's like, there's the 1% reality and then there's the 99% reality, right? And so the 1% reality, connects very much, or this idea connects very much to our Masur, because the 1% reality is like, say, like the body consciousness, like things that like we eat, physicality, rest, things that have to do with the physicality, like even consumption, acquisition, all these things are connected to the physical reality. So we live in a world where God knew that we were going to have this problem where we saw things physically, and we were going to have impulses, and we were going to go after those things, and then after we got those things, it wouldn't be enough, and we would want something else after that, and that wouldn't be enough, and we'll want something else after that, and that wouldn't be enough, and that, and on and on and on. So God knew that. So what God did was he says, okay, you know what, first he revealed an information to what we call the prophets, which were people who were able to see more of this 99% reality, So that's why when they asked a question like Abraham, like, how could Abraham know the entire Torah, and the Torah wasn't even revealed yet? Like, how did he keep all the mitzvahs of the Torah? Is because his mind was his mind was clear enough, or his mind had enough kedusha or ruchnius or whatever. He had this spiritual mind where he was able to see what science needs to see with a telescope, which is like the physicality around him. That doesn't, I mean, that not to, I mean, the energy that's around him and the physicality around him. So Abraham was able to see, like, okay, I shouldn't eat this type of food because he could see the 99% of that energy around the food. I shouldn't travel to certain places because he could see the energy around that, or people, or different actions, or people's attitudes, or words, or whatever. He was able to see the energy. So he was able to live in accordance to what Hashem wants us to live by. Like, he was able to live in accordance with that. And so that Masurah of being able to see what God wanted, and to be able to see this 99% reality, and to see what was Kodesh and what was, impure, what was holy and what was impure. Like he was able to see that. And so that was the tradition of what he saw is what he passed on to Isaac. And Isaac passed it on to Jacob, and Jacob passed it on to his sons, which became the tribes, the Shvatim, and eventually, led us here to where we're at in this portion, which is, Moshe coming to redeem these people and ultimately do what? Connect them to what? This 99% consciousness. Because the whole idea with the plagues was what? And this is like a big idea, and this is going to connect us to like a whole big discussion, is when you look at the 10 plagues were an expression of what, say, Rabbi Isaac Luria talks about, which is these 10 different dimensions of how energy comes into this world that comes from God. So the Jewish people, the Israelites, were not living like Jews. They were living in a different way. They got caught up, and they started thinking differently. They got seduced, they got, like they say in hip hop, you got caught up, you got caught up. And so what happened was that because they were not connecting to this 99%, and in fact, they were doing the opposite. They were connecting to dark stuff. And so because of that, they created blockages between them and God. And so those blockages were expressed in the Torah right now as plagues, right? These plagues showed that there was a blockage between the light force and the Israelites. And the intermediary of this blockage was like the plagues, for example, like all these, crazy things that were happening, and animals manifesting, and people dying, and all types of things. And so the Israelites had to go through this process of seeing these blockages that existed in the world that, largely had to do with them, but seeing them not from the standpoint of them affecting them necessarily in a bad way, because we know the stories, like the Egyptians, if they drunk from the Nile, the Egyptians were drinking blood, and the Jews were drinking water. So it wasn't the fact that these plagues were necessarily there attacking them. I think the kiddush in the whole situation is the idea that the whole world was being affected, like the world was suffering because of this disconnection that the Jewish people were having with Hashem. So like on one level, we could look at, okay, the Egyptians were negative, the Egyptians were bad. Okay, all right, that's one level to look at it. For sure, that's the case. The Torah of Masor says Egyptians were overly harsh to the Jewish people and these different things. But what we're talking about is that the world was suffering because the Jewish people were not living up to what they were supposed to be living up to. They weren't living in the ways of Avraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were living, in a different way. And so that, it's almost like you have like, two people in a relationship, right? And these two people are in a relationship, and then one of the people in the relationship is like cheating on the other person. It's not really discussed, it's not fully said, but the secrets and the deceit and the lying and the disconnection creates an energy between the two people that's not even being discussed, but it's over time separating them from each other into, maybe it's dark, maybe it leads to a fight, maybe it leads to, some other type of negative interaction, whatever. But the point is the same. It's this energy that's being created by not fulfilling one's role in a relationship. And so like that's the Jewish people, with Hashem. It's like we were not fulfilling our our dynamic. And so kind of like the idea is just to say that, maybe we could look at, and this is kind of like what I wanted to hear your thoughts on, is to maybe look at ourselves and say like, hey, you know what, like Hashem is constantly trying to give me light. He's constantly trying to give me bracha. And this is what is constantly going on. He's constantly giving life. He's constantly giving sun. He's constantly giving oxygen. He's constantly giving gravity. He's constantly giving and giving us life. Like every second, Hashem's constantly giving us life, but he wants to give us more. But the thing is, when we go away from our connection to, God and the Torah, when we do things that are opposite than our responsibility as Jews, then we start to create these blockages, these klippas, as they say in Hasidus. You know, these klippas, these blockages, these dividers, these separation. It's almost like the analogy I heard used a lot is like, you know, you see a lamp. You can go inside of a house and you see a lamp, right? And then what you do is you go inside, you know, say the someone's closet and they have a bunch of scarves, right? And so you take one of those scarves and you put it over that lamp. And then you take another scarf and you put it on the lamp. And then eventually, you know, the light gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer and dimmer until maybe there's no more light at all. So it's like every time we do something against Hashem, every time we do something against the Torah, we create a veil over the light, right? So it's not that God ever disappears from us or God goes away. It's just like we just created so many veils over the light that it becomes dark, right? And you forget about who you are. And we talked about last week, you know, the Jewish people, you know, in essence, you know, like pretty much forgetting about their like imagination, you know what I mean? And forgetting about who they were and forgetting about what their purpose was and the lineage that they came from. And so that idea comes from this level of darkness, these levels of klippas. And so the idea is that I want to hear what your thoughts were, was just this idea of saying that, like, you know, when we look at a lot of the problems that exist in the world, and this is just an open point of discussion, when we look at a lot of problems in the world, it's like a lot of times like the way the institutions that we live in, they kind of like focus us in specific ways on how to deal with different problems. So like, say for example, like me being African American, right? A lot of times, like if I have a challenge, like say in the Jewish community, outside the Jewish community, the business world, you know, maybe it's a personnel issue, you know, maybe it's, you know, certain systematic inequalities. You know, the first thing that I'm looking, the way the system tells me to deal with it is to, like, you know, challenge it more in our generation than maybe in the past, but to challenge, you know, this issue and confront this issue and and reveal the inequity, you know, and these different types of things. But I'm arguing based off of what's going on in this week's Parsha is to look at, you know, the darkness that I see in the world and maybe looking at myself and looking at, like, you know, like Hashem creates judgment in the world, but how much of that judgment am I creating through my actions? Like how much of it is a participatory thing that if I'm transgressing, if I'm not living a certain way, if I'm going a certain way, that Hashem is going to manifest certain things to compel me to ask questions, to compel me to maybe stop, to compel me to break down. But the system we live in just wants us to blame it on the other guy. You know, he wants us to blame it on the institution. And it's like, as a person, as a Black man, how am I able to evolve out of the challenges that I see in my society when there's no self, you know, actualization aspect with me and the creator, but only with me and my fellow man. And on top of that, I'm going to need assistance from other people who are in more powerful positions than me to even make any changes too, which is also, I think, kind of defeating in terms of dealing with my own problems. But what do you think about that as, like, from an African American perspective, like challenging, saying like, well, maybe the narrative of how we deal with things should maybe be like altered?
I mean, there's always that aspect of fighting for equality, of fighting the inequality, of confronting the evil. But I do hear what you're saying about that lack of introspection.
Yeah.
Here, to tie it back into the Parsha, we find lots of people on the Egyptian side. If we're going to talk about the Sphirot as being a level of revelation and God's revealing light and pouring these light through these various filters out to the Jewish people and out to the world at large, Basia would convert the daughter of Pharaoh. Eventually, we would find a whole Erev Rav, a whole group of people from Egypt who would go along with the Jewish people. it seems like that even in the darkness, even in the darkness of the system, even those who are most complicit in the system, even those who are the most part of the system, still can see some light. Now, just to bring that back up.
Well, yeah, actually this is a great opportunity to because this goes into kind of like the second part about it. Because the first part is just really kind of like this idea of saying that like, hey, what we're seeing right now is the blockage of Hashem's bracha coming into this world, and it's expressed through these idea of plagues. And these plagues are removing the blockages between, like, say, from Hesed to Gevurah to Gevurah to Tiferet, all the way down to Malchut. It's like these different blockages that exist. Like for example, like if Hashem wants to give to me, and the way that I'm able to understand Hashem bringing bracha is like through this matrix called the 10 spheros.
Right.
And we're saying that at each in these different 10 dimensions, that energy, matures and changes in different specific ways until it's manifested on the physical, on the most physical levels. And we're saying that my actions can put a like a filter or a blockage between how this energy disseminates into this world.
Right.
And so the idea is to be able to, and as this blockage exists, things could become very dark for us. Things can that we may lack energy, we may lack inspiration, we may lack hope. We may lack different things like pranasa coming into our life, good health coming into our life. These different things come in our life because all these things are coming through forms of energy to us all the time. But if we're blocking it, then we're then in essence we're out. So we're talking about the transformation of that light that's been blocked for, like, say, 200 and something years.
Right.
In Mitzrayim, that those blockages are being removed. It's like sometimes, like, you have like a family, right? And then the family has like a lot of issues, right? And it's been like the family's been carrying a lot of issues for decades. And so all of a sudden, the family decides to go and see like a therapist, a family therapist. They want to get better, they want to become closer. And so they go and they see this family therapist, and all this stuff starts to come out. It's like crying and screaming and pain and yelling and frustration and you did this to me, and regret and forgiveness, all these, and when that family's sitting inside that room, sometimes it could look like painful and disgusting. It's like it's stuff all over the place, but that pain needed to come out in order for this family to become closer and to rebuild. So in the same way that the plagues were an expression of these spiritual blockages that exist for the Jewish people, and because they exist, because they didn't exist for the Israelites, these spiritual blockages existed. The spiritual blockages, they existed. They and it was time for it to change. This is what the whole experiencing of the plagues was coming from. And it was in that. So I'm saying to really look at it from that standpoint, and then being able to look at myself as a spiritual human being, as a Ben Adam, and being able to say, like, hey, where are there blockages in my life? Where are there things that through my actions I'm not getting maybe the parnasa I want, or maybe I'm not making learning the way that I want to, or maybe personal relationships aren't going the way that I want to. So there's some blockage, because Hashem wants me to have the perfect amount of pranasa. He wants me, and even if He is giving me the perfect amount of pranasa, He wants me to have the perception that I'm receiving the perfect amount of pranasa. So all these things are like these different lights or these different blockages that need to be cleared out. So that's one point. Then the second point, and now I'm going to quote the famous Rabbi Rishon, who's out in New York, and very, very brilliant man. But I remember we had a conversation once, and I can't quote exactly what Mefarshim said this. I'm not sure, but he gave me this source. But it builds into this other concept because one of the big themes of the exodus of Egypt, which isn't really talked about as much, is the gearing. Like the convert plays such a humongous role in this whole dramatic episode that happens in Mitzrayim. And so Rabbi Rishon, so he said to me like this. So there's a big question that Chazal asked. They asked a question. He said, "Well, why?" It's twofold. It's very twofold because you can even bring out a little point of reparations on this too as well. So there's an interesting point on this. So it says that they asked a question. God comes to Abraham and says, "You know what? Your future descendants are going to go into slavery, for a certain amount of time, but they're going to leave with great riches, right?" So the question is, like, the people ask the question, like, what do you mean great riches? Like, what do you mean great riches? Like, why would Hashem promise great riches? Why wouldn't he promise them they're going to leave with maximum levels of kindness? They're going to leave with superb health. They're going to leave with a great sense of humor. You know what I mean? They're going to laugh the whole thing. Whatever idea, they're going to leave with great wisdom. They're going to leave with great, admiration, great appreciation, whatever. Why do they have to leave with great riches? So there's 2 points on it. One I learned from Rabbi Rishon, and one is a very popular chazal. So, and it ties in, actually, in this one, the popular chazal ties into reparations. So they say that the reason why the Jewish people had to leave with great wealth, because we know they left with the wealth of the Egyptians, the physical kalim, different things, vessels that they had. They left with that, which was, and then even the backtrack before that is during the generation of Yosef Asadik, that when the whole world was in famine, the whole world came and sold themselves to Yosef, and they brought all their wealth. So all the wealth in the world was inside of Egypt at that time, because Yosef gathered all of it. So when the Jewish people left with, from this shita, they left with money, right? They left with money, and so that money that they left with, the money that they left with. Why is my neighbor doing this? But I'm in Merisharim right now, so you hear all type of interesting sounds in the background. But they left with money, and so they said the reason why it was important for them to leave with all the wealth of the world, at least that wealth, is because they needed to be paid back for all the years they were working for free. And them being paid back and receiving cash for that was one of the first transformational parts to leave slavery. Because once a person is paid for what they've done, they're no longer under the umbrella of slavery. They just got paid late versus not being paid at all. So that's an interesting thing when you think about the importance of reparations for African Americans. It's not just like, giving a check, but it's also part of, according to Chazal, it's part of also removing, because the Jewish people, the Torah says slaves need to get reparations. This is the Torah saying this. This is like God saying that in order for people to, once they were taken advantage of and brutalized through slavery, in order for them to evolve into that next stage of life, they have to be paid back. This is the Torah. This is our whole thing. And so the shita that Chazal says is like they had to be paid because that was part of the transformational idea outside of slavery. But the part I want to talk about is what I learned from Rabbi Rishon, and he was quoting a chazal, and he said that he learned out that the riches that the Jewish people left with were the gerim that converted in Mitzrayim. That the gerim that were in Mitzrayim that saw all of the naces, saw all the makas, saw all the different amazing, mind-blowing things that were happening. When they saw that the Jewish people were about to leave, they were just like, hey, you know what? Moshe, we're with you. Like, can we join in on this? This is like the only true reality. The light force is completely clear. Like you were saying earlier, like, some of the Egyptians, they saw the light too, right? And so, and that's interesting about the mixed multitudes, because it's interesting. If they were just Egyptians, then you would be able to say like, oh, well, the Torah would say there were Egyptians that left with the Jewish people, but it says no, mixed multitudes. And so we could learn out from that during that time in Egypt, there were people living there from all over the world. It was like the trade capital of the world. It's like the United States or any, you know, transnational country that had tremendous economic power. Like everybody who was there doing business. So you could look at a lot of different races that were there. There's people from China that were there. There was people that were from other parts of the world. People that were from Europe. People that were, you know, from what we would call the Philippines. You know, I mean, I'm saying these parts of the world that were governed by different parts of the equator. You know, these people are all living there, and so you could really look out and say, like, wait, the people who comprised Mount Sinai were not just the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There were also the people who lived in Mitzrayim too that were not Jewish at all, and that were not only that were not like even like limited to Egyptians. They were a mixture of all types of people. So when you think about the people who stood on Mount Sinai, you know, when you think about like all these different, like especially here in Israel, like you see like, you know, Jews, like Chinese Jews, you see African Jews, you see American Jews, you see Swiss, Dutch, all these different, you know, types of Jews all over from all over the world. But the thing is that um, um, you know, we look at people when they come into the shul and we're like, how'd you get here? You know, what's going on? What's your story? You know, and it's like, and all those things are fair, but we shouldn't be shocked. If we're connected to our Torah, we're connected to our Masorah, we shouldn't be shocked that someone from a country like China or, you know, someone who's African American or someone who is, you know, from, you know, an African Congo or different places like this, that we shouldn't be shocked and think like, well, how could they become Jewish? You'd be like, what do you mean? There were people in Mitzrayim, we're reading about this right now, people in Mitzrayim that saw God's revelation and said, we want to leave everything behind and we want to join this movement. And so the people who stood on Mount Sinai, who brought the Torah into this whole world, were a combination of people who were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also people who were just like anyone else that you see walking on the street that were not considered Jewish at that particular time. And this is how the story of the Torah into this world starts off. But the point that I wanted to bring up was Rabbi Rishon said was that he's saying that why that the converts were the wealth, the great wealth that the Israelites, because the point is going off of the promise that God made to Abraham. God says, Abraham, your descendants are going to go into great slavery, and they're going to leave with great wealth, right? So on one level, we can learn out the great wealth that they took with them was the physical kalim that they got from the Egyptians, you know, the vessels, the stones, the bracelets, the necklaces, the Prada purses, all that type of stuff.
Like that.
Huh?
Precious metals, gold, silver, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one level to look at it. But the shita that Rabbi Rishon brought was this idea of saying that no, the great wealth that they left with, it wasn't his point, he was quoting someone else. The great wealth that they left with was the converts that converted with them. Why? Because the Jewish people were enslaved for 210 years, right? Of harsh, brutal slavery. And they didn't even know who they were anymore, right? And so the people, the mixed multitudes, they were already assimilated. They knew how to live like regular, normal human beings. So the Jewish people needed the mixed multitudes as they assimilated into being normal functioning human beings again. And when you look at, say, like African Americans, it's like there was no rehabilitation process for them after slavery. They just threw them off the plantation and said, figure it out, boy, you know, type of a thing, you know. And you know, and then they put in all these prison laws that if you commit any crime, if you do anything, you go back, and it was the 13th Amendment, that you go back into some type of indentured servitude if you commit a crime or whatever. So the whole thing is there was no process of rehabilitation ever for African Americans. And we've just been like trying to figure out as we go. But the point that just to stay focused on it, and I think it goes, we connect this whole thing to Badya, is this idea of, if we're saying that the wealth that the Jewish people left with was if we're holding by what Rabbi Rishon was saying, and we're holding by the wealth that they held, by the wealth that they left with were the Gerim, and the Gerim were there to help them assimilate into mainstream society, then we could backtrack and maybe we could look at what God was trying to teach us with Batya bringing in Moshe, because Moshe represented all the Jewish people in essence, all the Baal Shem Tov says all the neshamot of Kol Israel were all imbued inside of Moshe Rabbeinu, right? And so when Batya brought him in, she just didn't bring him in. She saved him from Pharaoh's decree, right? She saved him from Pharaoh's decree, which in essence was saving all the Jewish people. She was saving the full redemption. She was saving all these different things. And so she was going against what existed in that moment. And by doing that, some people say she converted before. There's Midrashim who said she converted before. Some Midrashim say she was coming out there to go and do a mikvah herself. And that's why she was there. There's different points around it. But the bottom line is, when she went against Pharaoh, who at the time was even her father, but the most powerful person in the world, and she went against him to save another life, that's when she became Jewish, right? That's when she became Jewish. And so this brings us to another question, which is, when we look at the world today, and I see what you're doing, other people are doing different things, online, and my point is to say that with all the anti-Semitism that exists in the world and all the miseducation, Ambassador Friedman from the United States to Israel, he said in a speech a few months ago that the biggest challenge that the American Jewry has is Jewish illiteracy. And that Jewish illiteracy is being used by sources of propaganda to turn a lot of Jews and even non-Jews, but specifically young Jews, against Israel, against, Jewish values and being taught that, like, and I'm not trying to go into like a lot of these other discussions around it, but the point is like this is the question, is that when does the Jewish community start to see the African American voice specifically as a conduit to heal, connect, and educate the world about Judaism? Like, when does that conversation start to happen where it's like, that it's not a joke anymore? You know what I mean? It's not just like something that, like, you have a guy like, say, like even a guy like, you have a guy like Nissim Black. He's doing things on his own. You know what I mean? Like, he has a career. He's extremely gifted, talented person, and people love him, and he's expanding and he's growing, and every day he gets bigger, right? But if you look at what Nissim Black as a person, if you compare him to institutions that are making an impact about teaching Judaism, sharing Judaism, inspiring Judaism, dispelling, myths and legends and misconceptions, like, he's doing all these things. But like, why is a guy like him not receiving? And I don't know what he's receiving, okay? I don't know what he's receiving, but I'm saying a guy like him should be, everyone who's investing into Kiruv and outreach in the world, some of that money should be going to, to support Nissim to be able to do even more and expecting more people. And you have publications out here, and you have all these different things. So at what point does the financial transfer go from the traditional approach to saying, hey, African Americans have the biggest voice in the world for the last 100-something years, and so when do we, who has African American Jews who are learned, who are inspired, that, are great representation, when do we start to leverage our African Americans to help Yiddishkeit, to speak on behalf of Rabbanu Shalom to other people? When do we start to leverage that in the same way that America and other Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 100 companies are doing? And I'm not saying use people, but I'm saying if people are there and they're creating platforms that can remove one bit of anti-Semitism, or anything like that, that, and so I want to ask you, like, what do you think the disconnection is around allowing the Gerim, if we're holding by Rabbi Rishon Shita, to help the Jewish people assimilate into mainstream society?
There's still that teaching of Chazal, though, that Kashim Garen Li Yisrael Kasapachas, that converts are harmful to Israel as an ailment of the skin. Amen. That, converts are still, they bring with them their coarseness from their home communities. They're not as refined as people who were brought up Jewish. They may have accents from places. They may speak differently. They may act differently. So there's still that idea of trying to keep foreign influences out, and by extension, keeping Gerim at a little bit of a distance.
I know, I hear that, and there are definitely masectas that say exactly what you're saying, and one of the most famous ones is that the Gerim are so inspired and so pure that they're able, that the work that they do embarrasses, much of the other Jewish people. So like, definitely I'm there with you, but I'm saying all the things that you just listed, why people have arguments against Gerim within the Jewish community, were all the very things that would make these Jews successful reaching out to the non-Jewish world.
True.
Because they talk differently, and because they still have connections to their old self, and they may have a bunch of tattoos, or or whatnot. You know what I mean? It's like, because of that, you know, because of that, these are the very things that could allow, African Americans to go to Temple University, and not necessarily to talk about geopolitics, but just talk about the spirituality of the Torah and what is done for them and their story. Not to put down, I don't think it's about Judaism being more right than Christianity or more right than Islam or anything like that. I think it's more about a person who's supposed to be Jewish and keep the 613 mitzvahs. That's what they're supposed to do, and they're going to be drawn to that particular system. It's not to say that other systems are wrong. All the systems play a role in Mashiach. You know what I mean? Like the Rambam speaks on this. You know what I mean? That the other nations or the monotheistic nations are very much aware that there's going to be a Mashiach, and they're very much aware that there has to be unity, and there has to be a certain legal system that exists on planet Earth. So like, they may have different outlooks on that, but either way. So the point is that I'm saying that is, we have things inside of our Torah that shows how the converts, whether it was an individual woman or a group of people, played a tremendous role with the transformation of the Jewish people into, I'm using, specific language, in the mainstream society. And when you think about, Israel, right? When you think about Israel, and you think about how Israel has changed much of the landscape of how Jews are perceived in the world, over the last like 70 something years, and how, in a way, the Jewish people were living in shtetls before this happened, whether it was shtetls in Europe or living underneath, Ottoman Muslim rulership in the Middle East. It's like, that's where, that's what Jews were dealing with. And so now that Israel is here, now it's just kind of like, okay, now we have to kind of like talk to everybody, and kind of like have to like explain like kind of like who we are and what we're doing. And we haven't done such a good job at that. And some of the people who are very much anti-Judaism and anti-Israel has really taken advantage of that, and have created a lot of divisive discourse on college campuses and in other, media institutions or whatnot, or media platforms. And so what I'm saying is that, why can't we start to address this new issue of communication to the broader public about Judaism, about Torah, these different things? Why can't we incorporate and see the African Americans specifically in America and their platforms as being foundational parts of this new discussion that the Jewish people have to have with the rest of the world? And we have proof that African Americans are extremely influential, and we have influential African American Jews, and from that place, it's like there needs to be capital invested into these people, and there needs to be capital invested into these platforms, because it's like, you know, not treating it like the system that currently exists is just a disservice to everybody. And so anyway, so that was my ideas on the parsha this week.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing. And remember, this is going to be going up on YouTube. Everyone, Mordechai Yosef Ben Avraham, thank you for joining us on Tribe Herald this week.
Mm-hmm.